This is Boomer Life on CL 650.
Can I get up with me? Can I get up with me? Can I get up with me?
Hey, and welcome back to The Law Show on CL 650 from McQuarrie LLP. We have Kevin Hyde, partner, and Neil Mulholland, associate counsel. And McQuarrie is where? Where are your offices?
We're right in Central City there, next to the new City Hall.
In Surrey.
In Surrey, and we're on the 15th floor of the building, and we actually, personal injury groups have actually been promoted, I'll say, up to the 18th floor as well. We have a second floor that we're taking over in the summer.
Rare air up there, huh? Is that one way? Better view?
Better
corner
view.
Office? Who gets the corner office?
Well, it's a round building, so there's no corners at all.
Well, that's good. All right, so we're talking about these larger cases where you have people who have catastrophic injuries and you're working on their behalf in personal injury there at McQuarrie LLP. So somebody's been in an accident and they're able to go back to work, doing whatever job. Even working here at a radio station, for example. But so how do you assess if they're at the same level they were before?
Yeah, so you're absolutely correct. Just going back to what we were talking about just prior to the break with the loss of future earning capacity component, if someone does go back to their job that they had prior to the MVA, the accident, that doesn't prevent them from getting a potential claim for a loss of future earning capacity. That person might return to their same job they had prior to the accident, but they might not be able to do that job to the same level. They might not get that promotion they would have had. They might not have taken those overtime shifts that are available to them. They might not, if they're, let go from that job for whatever reason, the business shuts down or cutting back, they might be the first one to go. And now that person is less employable than they were prior to the accident. So
maybe somebody brought them back in that role as a sort of a bit of a favor to get them back to work, but that...
well, employers have a duty to accommodate you to a certain degree.
So that empathy that employer has, if the business is sold, maybe that new owner doesn't have that anymore.
If it's sold, if it's downsizing, or whatever the case may be, if you're let go from that job, it might be more difficult for you now after that accident with the injuries that you're living with to find a new job. There might have been a much larger amount of jobs available to you prior to the accident that is now shrunken as a result of your injuries.
So who determines whether, okay, yes, this person can go back to this job, but the likelihood that they're going to be on a promotion path or expand what they could do is limited? How do you determine that?
Well, there's a couple of approaches to that. I mean, you start with the medical evidence. So you have a doctor's report will say that somebody has ongoing chronic lower back pain, for example. And you then will have them evaluated by an occupational therapist in a process which we call a functional capacity evaluation. And this is an 8-hour or more battery of tests.
Often 2 days.
It can even be 2 days in some cases. It's a lengthy battery of tests that is designed to to determine the outer limits of all of your different physical capacities, whether it's your ability to stand in one place or sit or carry or lift or so forth.
Is it just physical?
It's mostly physical, but it also tests things like, for example, computational skills. Can you quickly add or subtract numbers in your head? That sort of thing. And the idea is that it's meant to test as much as possible, the full range of physical activities that can come into play in a typical workplace. The end result of that evaluation is that we get a report, 40-plus pages, which is full of very, very useful detail, because it'll give us a precise idea of the kinds of occupations this client can no longer do on a full-time basis.
For example, if you're a hairdresser and you stand all day, and you're not able to stand all day, that's going to greatly affect your ability to work, right?
Even more so, because hairdressers work with their arms elevated all day, and that is a terrible thing for somebody with upper back and neck injuries.
Yes.
But one of the more challenging cases, and in practice, one of the more commonplace, is where the client is able to go back to her previous job and do it just fine. And no one's doing them any favors or any accommodations. They're actually performing quite adequately. But if they ever had to go out and find a new job, they will be less competitive. And this is oftentimes one of the key points of argument between ourselves and the defense on any given file, is the defense will often say, well, look, your client is back to her job. She's earning the same income as she was before. She's even doing the overtime that she used to do and has even had a promotion since she returned to work. How could you possibly have any claim for future income loss? Well, the answer to that is in a series of cases from our Court of Appeal that began in the mid-1990s. And what they basically say is that if someone has been left as, quote-unquote, damaged goods, even if they're able to perform adequately in their pre-accident role, the fact is you've got to look at what the impact might be right up to the day they turn 65. And if their ability to go out and find a new job has been compromised, if they've been made less competitive in that labor market, then our law says that's got to be compensated separately from any past income loss that you can calculate.
So can you give us an example of somebody who was able to function in their previous job or their existing job and got a settlement? Could you have any examples of that?
Quite a few. In many cases, for example, you'll get people in the construction field, the building trades fields, where their jobs are usually fairly physical. And in many cases, they'll be very motivated to get back to work. The jobs often pay well. Oftentimes, these are clients who were physically quite fit beforehand. And so they're very driven to get back into the job as soon as they possibly can. And they're able to do it, but they realize they're at the edge of their capacity. And in some cases, these are fairly young guys. I had a claim about 10 years ago involving a guy who was in his mid-20s and was a concrete finisher, a job that involves a lot of crouching, a lot of bending and awkward positions. And he had a fairly significant low back injury. But he was, as I was saying, very, very motivated to get back into work, pushed himself at the gym and so forth, followed every possible treatment recommendation he could have found. And within 6 months, he was working full-time again. But the problem was that he was no longer able to play soccer, which he used to do on a casual basis with his friends. He couldn't sit through a 2-hour movie anymore. And these things all pointed the direction towards, his ability to do this job, perhaps up till his 65th birthday, is maybe not going to be there anymore. His ability to move beyond that job into other, perhaps more lucrative fields or just alternative fields is no longer going to be there. It's those kinds of things that the law seeks to compensate for. And the way they typically measure this is they say, well, look, as a result of the accident, your capital asset has been impaired. Your capital asset is sort of a conceptual way of looking at the sum total of all of your work experience, all of your training and education, all of your credentials and tickets and qualifications. And if any part of that has been taken away from you, that's a loss. And it's typically measured in multiples or fractions of a year's salary. So a year's salary is kind of a benchmark number that courts have typically applied to this kind of approach. And so in many, many cases, for example, if you've got a guy who's 25 and he can do his old job, but he's going to be significantly limited in any further employment endeavors beyond that, you may be looking at a guy who's entitled to 2 or 3 years' salary just for that. On the other hand, if he's 64,
you get 1 year.
You might get $10.
Or is that right?
You might get a nominal amount, in other words.
Sorry, go ahead, Neil.
And the other thing we have to look at is if this client has lost part of her capital asset, is that part of the capital asset that she's lost something that she would ever have realistically used? In other words, if you have a client who, for example, has always worked in retail, who is, very slightly built and has really no inclination towards heavy physical labor, and if she's at the end result of a motor vehicle accident unable to work as a miner or a logger or a heavy-duty mechanic.
Wasn't likely to happen anyway.
Exactly. On the other hand, if you have a client who is a grade 10 dropout, who has very, very limited academic ability, but has a great work ethic and a strong back, and was making good money in the resource sector.
As a logger, yeah.
And then at 24, suffers three burst fractures in his spine and is unable to ever go back to that line of work. Well, his settlement will likely be the total amount of the insurance money available.
All right, we have about a minute to go here, so I just wanted to get a final wrap-up. Kevin, you've been very good on this. You've been sitting quietly. Neil's been talking. So we'll turn to you. What is it that you have to say to our listeners about having representation if you're dealing with ICBC and you've been in a motor vehicle accident?
Well, everything Neil was just talking about with regards to advancing a loss of future earning capacity claim, even if you return to your job before, or if you haven't, ICBC, it's almost their policy to just ignore that unless you have representation. So
they wouldn't ask you about that. They're not going to voluntarily bring
They're
that
not
up.
voluntarily going to bring that up. And the onus is on you to prove that and get the proper reports, such as the functional capacity evaluation exam and any other experts that you need to see and get reports from to prove your case. And as we were saying, Macquarie LLP can do that for you, get the proper reports, put you in the strongest position possible to negotiate with ICBC to get that fair settlement that you deserve, including if in your circumstances it warranted a loss of future earning capacity component, which can be, as we've been discussing, quite large in certain cases.
And going to a firm like Macquarie, you obviously have a vast wealth of expertise in your field. You're not experts, but I mean, you have a lot of experience. So that's something to draw on, right?
Yeah, we
Very
do,
much,
definitely.
yeah. One thing to understand is that when you're dealing with ICBC on your own, you're dealing with somebody who does this for a living. This is
a professional against an amateur.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I mean, you oftentimes hear of people who, because they have a background in finance or insurance or even in the legal system, they may think that they're in a reasonably good position to handle their claim with ICBC. Well, the problem is, unless you've got 40 hours a week to devote to it, unless you've got the time to educate yourself on the various nuances of the system, the various things that they won't tell you, odds are you're going to be at a serious disadvantage. And the adjuster on the other end of that telephone has the resources of a fairly large corporation behind him. He has workbooks and seminars and manuals on how to defeat you.
So do not be signing that release until you've seen or talked to a lawyer.
And one thing I've learned from you is once you sign with Macquarie, for example, they can't contact you any longer.
That's right.
They have to go through.
And for some, that's one of the most attractive things from the get-go. They don't realize that, hey, you're with us, we're going to get you a lot more money. A lot of people just simply say, this adjuster will stop calling me finally.
Yeah.
I don't want to deal with this, and I can concentrate on my treatment and getting better from my injuries. And that's what's most important. We take that stress off your hands.
And there's another important aspect to that too, and that's the privacy issue.
Right.
You know, when you deal with ICBC yourself, you will sign an authorization that lets them get all of your medical records. When you hire a law firm to deal with this, we get them first, and we edit out those matters that are completely irrelevant and unconnected to the accident.
We'll leave it there. Thank you. That's Neil Mulholland, Associate Counsel at Macquarie LLP, and Kevin Hyde, partner at Macquarie LLP, being our guest today on The Law Show. Thanks, both of you, for coming in and giving us some wonderful information.
Thanks for having us.
And we'll speak to you next time on The Law Show on CL 650.